Chapter 27. Miami. James and Junior touched down in Miami on Saturday evening. Keith had changed his plans and flown out a couple of days earlier with his minder, George. The beefy ex-heavyweight met the boys at immigration and drove them to Keith's house in a Range Rover. James spent the whole drive with his face stuck up against the window like a 5-year-old. He loved the little differences that make you know you're in a different country. Traffic lights strung over the road on wires, billboards with prices marked in dollars, the huge double-trailer trucks that looked like they'd roll over your car without the man in the cab feeling so much as a jolt. Automatic gates parted obediently when the car got near Keith's house. The pastel blue building sprawled out behind massive palm trees. There were 2 stories, with balconies overlooking the ocean and lush terraces planted with palm trees and flowering cacti. "Your dad is so loaded," James said as he stepped out of the car, shaking his head in disbelief. "Come and check out his cars," Junior said. There was a separate garage, the size of which reminded James of a fire station. The boys wandered in as George dealt with their bags. There was a row of everyday modern BMWs and Mercedes, but the exciting stuff was parked behind. The outlines of 7 Porsches, clad in protective blankets. Junior pulled up a corner of one, revealing a headlamp. "This ran in the Le Mans 24-hour race," Junior said. "My dad had it taken up to Daytona for a track day. He got it up to 300 kilometers an hour on the straight." "Class," James said. "Like my motors, James?" Keith asked. James turned around to see Keith standing in the doorway, wearing pool shoes and an unbuttoned Hawaiian shirt. "You've got a different Porsche for every day of the week," James grinned. "I'll take you for a cruise down South Beach in one of them tomorrow night," Keith said. "It's all lit up with neon signs after dark, and there's heaps of great restaurants. Did you see anything else you wanted to do in that guidebook?" "Is it too far to go up to Orlando?" James asked. "Junior said Universal Studios is cool." "It's a few hundred kilometers," Keith said, "but it's no hassle driving out there. We can stay overnight and get a couple of theme parks in if you want. I've got some business to sort out, but that should be wrapped up in a day or 2. Was there anywhere else?" James shrugged. "I don't know. Don't put yourself out or anything. Me and Junior can hang out on the beach, go shopping and stuff." "The fan boats over the Everglades are good fun," Keith said. "And how are you set for spending money?" He pulled a roll of dollars from the back of his shorts. "I can't take money off you as well," James said. "You've already paid for my flight and everything." Keith handed James $300 bills and gave the same to Junior. "Buy something for April at the mall," Keith said. "She's sweet on you." "Cheers," James said. "Is it all right if I use the phone to tell Zara I've arrived?" "Sure," Keith said, spreading his arms out wide. "With a house this size, the phone bill is the least of my worries." After a quick call home, the 2 boys stripped to their boxers, jumped off the wooden decking at the back of the house, and sprinted across the deserted white beach towards the ocean. James was feeling groggy after 8 hours crammed on an aeroplane, but all that washed away as he curled his toes in the mushy sand and let the seawater spew over his chest. "I'm so glad you came instead of Ringo," Junior said, raising his voice above the waves. "This week is going to be such a laugh." James slept in one of the guest bedrooms. He had a 4-poster bed, plus an ensuite bathroom with a giant marble tub. When he woke up, he slid on shorts and a t-shirt and opened up a set of glass doors that led onto a balcony overlooking the ocean. He took some lungfuls of sea air and leaned against the metal railing, letting the sun toast his skin. The coastline was dotted with yachts and motor launches out for a Sunday morning cruise. An elderly Hispanic gardener was hosing the terraces below. The man nodded politely when their eyes met. It made James wonder where he'd end up in life. Would he have the $10 million oceanfront house? Or would he be like the crinkled old guy who watered the flowers? "Yo!" Junior shouted. He came strolling through James's bedroom and stepped onto the balcony. "What are you doing out here?" Junior asked. James shrugged. "Just thinking." "Dumb idea," Junior said. "Thinking wears out your brain. My dad wants us downstairs. We're going to IHOP for breakfast. You what? It's a pancake place, Junior explained. I'm getting a stack of strawberry whipped cream pancakes. They give you so much, you can barely move when you finish. Dad and George are going into town for some business meeting, so they're dropping us at the Mega Mall. It's about 20 times the size of the Reef Centre. We can spill some dosh on shopping. Then there's a 16-screen cinema and a roller coaster if we get bored. Sounds good, James grinned. James bought himself new jeans and swimming shorts and a couple of CDs, including one as a present for Kerry. Then they caught a movie and waited around until George arrived to collect them. It was mid-afternoon when they got back to the house. How was the meeting? James asked. Good, Keith grinned. Very, very good. Does that mean I'll be able to go back to making money from deliveries? I don't know about that, Keith said awkwardly. Everything is going to be different. Do you fancy going for a swim now the sun's lower? Actually, James said, do you mind if I use your laptop to email my family? No worries, Keith said. George, Keith and Junior put on swimming shorts and walked down to the sea. Once they were out of sight, James raced up to his room and got a couple of USB memory sticks and a Hacker's Toolkit CD-ROM out of the bottom of his bag. He climbed onto one of the metal stools at the breakfast bar in the kitchen, turned on Keith's laptop and connected to the internet. James clicked on Hotmail and checked the emails in an account he'd set up for his James Beckett alias. He had 3 messages from April, including one that contained a blurry photo of April and Erin in their ski suits with the message, "Miss you already, April, XXX." James replied insincerely with "Miss you too," before writing a longer message to Kerry, gloating about the weather and the beautiful house he was staying in. When he'd finished typing his emails, James stood up and peeked out the window, making sure Keith, George and Junior were well clear of the house. As he flipped confidently through the files on the laptop, he realised that his marathon training sessions with Amy had been worth the brain ache. He clicked on Keith's documents folder. There were a couple of hundred files inside. Most had a little padlock symbol next to them, meaning they were encrypted. James decided it was too risky trying to read stuff with Keith just down on the beach. Instead, he plugged a memory card into the USB socket on the side of the laptop. The card was only the size of a pen top, but it held as much data as 6 CDs. A grey box popped up on the screen. New USB device detected. James checked the size of Keith's documents folder and realised there was enough space on the memory card to copy the whole lot over. He waited a couple of anxious minutes while the computer copied Keith's files. Then he switched off the laptop and walked back to his bedroom. He got his mobile out of his luggage and set it to search for an American network. When it found a connection, James speed dialed the number of a local drug enforcement agency office he'd been given before he left. John Jones answered. James? Hi. Settled in okay? John asked. Not bad, James said. You? My flight was fine, but the heat out here does me in. I'm more of a fish and chip supper on a cold winter night kind of guy. I can't talk for long, James said. I've been through Keith's laptop. Anything exciting? Dunno, James said. I checked for fancy stuff, like hidden partitions on the hard drive, but there's none of that. All Keith's documents are encrypted. I didn't want to fiddle about trying to open them. I've copied the whole lot onto a memory card for you guys to deal with. Good work, John said. The only thing is, how do I get the card to you? We can arrange an unscheduled rubbish collection for this evening. Have you got something you want to throw out that you can hide the memory card inside? James looked around the room. Well, there's a half-eaten box of milk duds I got at the cinema, he said. I can stick the memory card inside that, then throw it out. Perfect, John said. Scrunch the box up so the card doesn't fall out. Then make sure you put your rubbish in the main bins out by the road. We'll send a dust cart along to pick them up. Will you guys be able to break the encryption? James asked. Depends on what software Keith's using, John said. But probably. Is there anything else you'd like to report? One thing Keith said struck me as odd, James said. I asked him when I'd be able to go back to making deliveries. Keith goes, I don't know, everything's going to be different. John said. I've no idea why he'd say that, but it's certainly interesting. I better go anyway. James said. They'll be wondering what I'm doing. Okay then, John said. Keep up the good work and watch out for yourself. Chapter 28. Orlando. James was having one of the best weeks of his life. Monday, he went out on a fishing boat with Junior. He'd never fished out in the ocean, but the crew showed him the basics and helped him reel his first catch. He called John Jones from the beach that evening with some snippets he'd picked up from Keith's telephone conversations. John told James that American drug enforcement agents had retrieved his milk duds box and MI5 specialists had managed to read most of the files. They contained details of several foreign bank accounts with transactions linking Keith to a money laundering operation whose specialty was collecting your cash, bouncing it around the world banking system until it was untraceable, and finally depositing it in an anonymous foreign bank account, minus their 25% commission. John didn't think it was enough information to get Keith convicted, but he reckoned it was a useful piece of the jigsaw. The next day, James, Junior and Keith set off early for the 350-kilometre drive up to Orlando. It was low season, so the boys had a great time at Islands of Adventure, scaring themselves witless on all the roller coasters and simulator rides without wasting too much time queuing. James went nuts in the gift shop, buying t-shirts for Kyle and Kerry and a little bib and shorts for Joshua. When he went to pay at the till, Keith put the whole lot on his credit card. By mid-afternoon, they were all knackered and sunburnt, so they checked into a hotel and showered before heading down to the restaurant. They got an outdoor table at the edge of a man-made lake with ducks and fountains in the middle. Keith ordered tagliatelle, while James and Junior got half-pound burgers and fries. The waitress brought walnut bread and olive oil to the table while they waited for their food. "I think I'm safe to talk here," Keith said, "unless a bunch of cops followed me up here and they're pointing a parabolic microphone at me from the other side of the lake." James looked away from the ducks, which were scrapping over a handful of bread he'd thrown into the pond, a second before he noticed the "Please do not feed the ducks" sign. "Talk about what?" Junior asked. "Anything," Keith said. "Do you think the cops are listening to you most of the time?" James asked. "The cops have got microphones everywhere," Keith said. "The house in Luton, the house in Miami, my cars, my offices. I don't even know what people I can trust anymore. I've even got the Secret Service after me." "MI5?" James asked. "They've been after me ever since the corruption allegations inside Operation Snort," Keith nodded. "One of my better sources told me George is working for the cops. I don't think it's true, but you can never be sure. He's a family man with a couple of kids. If the cops threatened him with a long stretch in prison, who knows what he'd be prepared to do." "Are you going to have him whacked?" Junior asked. Keith burst out laughing. "Ah, son. If I had somebody killed every time I heard a rumour about an informant, I'd be a mass murderer. The cops plant most of these rumours, hoping it will create friction inside KMG. We get our own back by dropping rumours that straight cops are taking bribes." "Have you ever had anyone killed?" Junior asked. "I get problems, and I tell people to make them go away," Keith said. "It's not my business to know whether they tickle the guy's feet until he promises to be a good boy, or chuck him off a 10th floor balcony." "Cool," Junior said, grinning. "You know that scene in the movies where the car's heading for the edge of the cliff and the cop cars are chasing?" Keith asked. "That's where everyone thinks I'm at. But the cops don't realise something." "What?" Junior said. "I've bailed out of the car," Keith said. "Everyone thinks I'm out here buying drugs, trying to get KMG up and running again. I've made a few noises in that direction, but all I'm really doing is settling debts and sorting out finances. I'll be staying in America for a few months until things die down back home. Then I'm going to rest on my laurels. How many millions does a man need anyway?" "That's cool, Dad," Junior smiled. "I don't ever want you going to prison." "What will happen to KMG without you?" James asked. "I expect it'll break into 1,000 pieces," Keith said. "Some people will go to prison. Some of the ones left on the outside will make contacts with my overseas suppliers and start importing cocaine themselves. In a year or two, nobody will even remember me. The same guys will be making deliveries and selling coke on the street. It'll just be new faces supplying them and stacking the big money into foreign bank accounts. Give it 4 or 5 years and you'll probably find one group has become dominant, a new KMG. The police will set up another Operation Snort type of deal, they'll break it up, then the whole cycle will start again. Stopping KMG must have some effect on the cocaine trade, James said. The police have budget cuts and efficiency targets. The drug dealers have got billions of pounds, Keith said. It's like the weediest kid in Year 7 picking a fight with the entire Year 12 rugby team. The police might land the odd punch, but they're always going to get their asses kicked at the end of the day. Do you think you'll stay out of prison? James asked. I'm shelling out enough in bribes and legal fees, Keith said. So let's hope for the best, eh? The waitress came over with the 3 plates of food. Anyway, Keith said, shoveling down his first mouthful of pasta, all this serious talk's going to spoil my appetite. You boys want to go see a movie or something tonight? James waited until Junior was asleep before slipping out of the hotel room. He made his nightly call to John Jones from an alcove down the corridor that had an ice dispenser and a couple of Pepsi machines in it. James explained about Keith's retirement plans. We've tracked down more of Keith's money with the information you copied off the computer, John said. I was starting to suspect Keith wasn't in Miami to do a drug deal, and what you said confirms that. But I still don't think he's told you the whole truth. Why's that? James asked. We traced a transaction from one of Keith's bank accounts in Trinidad. Keith just purchased $500,000 worth of US Treasury bonds in the name of Aaron Moore. We contacted the bank and asked for details. Keith Moore has handed the bonds over to the bank with instructions to sell them on Aaron Moore's 18th birthday and pay her the money. Keith has made similar transactions for Junior, April, and Ringo. He's also set up a trust fund for his ex-wife. He's paid off the mortgages for the 2 houses in England and sold the house in Miami for a lot less than it's worth, to raise fast cash. But Keith told me he's planning to stay in Miami until the heat dies down back in England. There's a new owner moving into the Miami house in 3 weeks, John said, and we can't find any trace of the $11 million he got from the sale. Do you think he's using the money to buy drugs? James asked. I don't think so. What then? How many boats have you seen since you got to Miami? John asked. Millions, James said. They're everywhere. Once he's set up the arrangements to provide for his family, I think Keith is going to sneak out of the house, climb aboard one of those boats, and vanish like a puff of smoke. How come? James said. Keith can feel the net closing in. He has informants inside Operation Snort, so he knows we're close to having enough evidence to put him behind bars for a seriously long stretch. Where will he go? James asked. $11 million will go a long way in South America. My money would be on Brazil. It's easy to disappear in a country with 200 million people. He can buy a new identity off some corrupt government official, maybe even have a spot of plastic surgery to change his appearance. What about his kids and stuff? They'll be set for life, financially, John said. Keith will have made double sure that the money set aside for his family can never be traced back to drug dealing. But he'll never be able to see them again. He won't see much of them from inside a jail cell either, John said. You keep telling me Keith is in a good mood, but that's all front. He's got to make decisions, and none of his options are easy. So what are you doing to stop him disappearing? James asked. We have a big problem. We've asked the Americans to put a 24-hour watch on Keith, but they're only prepared to spare us one DEA agent. We've even offered to pay their costs, but they're short-staffed and they've got their own bad guys to catch. We're having more meetings with the Yanks to try and sort out a deal, but for at least the next few days, there's nothing to stop Keith Moore slipping off into the night. Except me, James said. Remember, you're undercover, John said, and you're supposed to be a regular kid, so don't interfere. All you can do is call me if you think he's about to leg it. James heard someone coming along the corridor and quickly hung up his phone. It was Keith, wearing a hotel gown and carrying the ice bucket from his room. James was in a t-shirt and boxers, so he had nowhere to hide his phone. Trouble sleeping? Keith asked. Who are you ringing at this time of night? CHERUB training teaches you to always have an excuse ready. Zara, James said. It's morning back home, and Joshua always wakes her up early. Most mobiles don't work in America, Keith said. You must have a tri-band. James's mobile phone had been modified by the intelligence service, so it worked on just about any network in the world. But he couldn't tell Keith that. "I've got no idea," James said, shrugging. "I just turned the thing on and it worked. I stepped out here because I didn't want to wake Junior up." "You know it's about £4 a minute, using your mobile from America," Keith said. "Is it?" James gasped, acting like he was really worried. "Oh, Hewitt will murder me when he gets the bill." Keith filled his ice bucket from the dispenser and put quarters in the Pepsi machine. "I must have got dehydrated walking about in the sun all day," he said. "I woke up with a raging thirst. Do you want one?" James nodded. "Yeah, I wouldn't mind." Keith fed in more quarters until a second can dropped out of the machine. He handed it to James, and they both pulled back the tabs and swallowed a couple of gassy mouthfuls. "I'm really grateful you brought me out here on holiday," James said. "Hewitt and Zara could never afford to take me abroad." "That's okay," Keith said, smiling. "When Ringo dropped out, it was me who suggested you came instead." "Really?" James said. "Why?" "You're the only one of Junior's mates I thought I could rely on to look after him if something bad happens," Keith said. "Bad like what?" James asked. "They could arrest me at any time, James. I know Junior likes to think he's the big man, but he's led a pretty sheltered life, and I'm a lot happier knowing there's a guy like you with him." "You've got George back in Miami," James said. "George is good for two things," Keith laughed. "Breaking heads and polishing cars. I've known the man since infant school, and I love him, but frankly, it's a miracle he can tie his own shoelaces." "Who knows?" James said. "Maybe you'll never get arrested." "Life is certainly full of surprises," Keith said. "I'll tell you that for nothing." He ripped off a monster belch that echoed down the corridor. James giggled and responded with a tiny burp. "Pathetic," Keith said. "Check this out." Keith tipped back his head to drain his can, then rolled out the longest, loudest belch James had ever heard. An elderly American was toddling along the corridor. She had giant rectangular sunglasses and the wrinkled face of somebody who'd spent too much of her life in the sun. "Why don't you mind your damn manners?" she said furiously. "Don't worry, ma'am," Keith said, giggling as he gently cuffed James around the back of the head. "I'll make sure the boy doesn't do it again." "It wasn't me," James gasped, struggling to keep a straight face. The woman shuffled a few more steps and stopped outside her room. As she rummaged through her handbag for the plastic card that unlocked her door, Keith stepped into the corridor and belched again. It wasn't as big as the first two, but it was still loud. James couldn't control himself and started howling with laughter. The woman scowled so hard, he half expected a laser beam to shoot out of her eyes. "This hotel used to attract decent people," she shouted. "Why don't you act your age?" Her door slammed. James and Keith stood there laughing for about 10 minutes. James got it so bad his sides started hurting. Keith looked at his watch. "You better get back to bed. It's gone midnight, and we're doing another theme park tomorrow." James crept back into his room, being careful not to wake up Junior. He took a quick pee before sliding between his sheets. He was tired, but his brain kept churning as he lay awake, listening to Junior's gentle breathing. James wondered if Keith really was planning to do a runner. It seemed sad that a guy who'd been showing him the time of his life was facing a choice between 20 years in prison and running off and never seeing his family again. James asked himself what he'd do if he saw Keith making a run for it. Would he grab his mobile the second he realised? Or give Keith time to get away? They left the hotel early next morning and went to Disney World, then spent the afternoon cooling off at a water park. It was getting dark by the time they left Orlando for the 5-hour drive back to Miami. James woke up late Thursday morning on his 4-poster bed in the Miami house. He was on top of his duvet, wearing the trainers and clothes he'd had on the day before. The last thing he could remember was falling asleep in the back seat of the car. He needed a shower, and his mouth tasted like a sewer. But before any of that, he scrambled downstairs to see if Keith was still around. George, Keith and Junior sat at the breakfast bar in the kitchen, wearing swimming shorts and watching a daytime talk show. "Here's Sleeping Beauty," Keith said. Junior started to laugh. What? James asked. I pinched your cheek and everything, Keith said. But you didn't bat an eyelid. I had to get George to carry you upstairs and dump you on your bed. All red-faced and tired out, Junior giggled. You look like a little angel. I can't remember a thing, James gasped. God, that's so embarrassing. It's all those midnight phone calls, Keith said. You're not getting enough sleep. James had a mental jolt. He'd missed his nightly call, and John Jones might be worried. I better go freshen up, James said. As soon as he got to his room, he found the overnight bag he'd taken to Orlando and grabbed his mobile. He tried to switch it on, but the battery was dead. He hunted around the room until he found his charger and his American socket adapter. The phone bleeped to life as soon as it was plugged in. Rip Van Winkle, John said. How are you feeling? Oh, don't you start, James said. How did you know about that? When it got to 1 a.m. and I still hadn't heard from you, I got worried. We got a track on your mobile phone signal and realized you were driving back from Orlando. Then your mobile stopped transmitting. It went flat, James explained. I forgot to take my charger with me. Pretty basic operational mistake, James, John said, tutting. But I guess we have to make allowances for the fact that you're 13 years old. I'm glad you make allowances at MI5, James laughed. Nobody from CHERUB ever does. Anyway, I thought I'd better check you were okay. So I hid in the bushes out back and watched George carry you out of the car. You looked like you were 6 years old, all bundled up in his big fat arms. I'm never going to live this down, James said. So, apart from me making an idiot of myself, nothing much happened yesterday. What about your end? The Yanks want to help us watch Keith, but they don't have the manpower. We think we've got enough evidence to convict Keith on tax evasion and money laundering charges, but that's only worth a 2 to 5 year sentence. We wanted to wait until we could bust him on drugs charges, but with no 24-hour surveillance and the risk of Keith running off for good, we've decided to move now. Extradition? James said. That's right, James. Bedfordshire Police will be contacting the DEA later today, asking them to arrest Keith on money laundering charges and send him back to Britain. We have to present our evidence to an American judge before they issue an arrest warrant. It'll take a day or so to get the paperwork together and organise the hearing. So you're hoping Keith doesn't leg it in the meantime? Exactly, John said. And one final thing. I got a message from Zara. Dr. McCafferty has decided to pull the CHERUB side of this operation, whether or not Keith Moore is in jail. Tell Junior and Keith that Ewett's been offered a decent job, and you're all moving back to London.